a brand new podcast from WKMS and PRX, Middle of Everywhere, shares big stories from the small places we call home. Rich with examples of tribalism and kinship, skepticism and idealism, defeat and triumph, hosts Ariel Lavery and Austin Carter tell stories of life in often overlooked rural America. They provide a connection for those who have left but still identify with small towns, and explore the growing appeal for many of rural life. Listen and subscribe to Middle of Everywhere, wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Chenj.
Hey, John.
You know, I'm not sure exactly where to start, but how about with this? That it's a good thing it wasn't just people who look like me out here voting.
Well, yeah, you know, like not just. I mean, but I'm glad you voted though, you know, like, and I'm also glad a whole bunch of black and brown folks went out and voted, sometimes standing in really long lines in Detroit, Atlanta, Milwaukee, Latino and Native folks in Arizona, and of course, here in the greatest city in the world where great things happen, Philadelphia.
So we're recording this conversation in the back half of November. At least on the day we're recording this, we still have a president who's publicly refusing to accept the result of an election he lost, though reportedly behind the scenes he's making plans for his post-presidency. Trump and his people have made a pathetic and deeply shameful attempt at a coup that probably won't succeed, but it has been a spectacle to behold.
Ooh. I mean, but you know, it's not really a surprise, right? Like no one who has watched Trump all this time thought he would ever admit to having lost fair and square. And even before the election, right? I mean, you could see all the signs. He said it would only be legitimate if he won. And so, but I think the real problem is that most elected members of his party and like millions of other people have now joined Trump in this alternate reality and are actually still trying to work to make it come true.
Right. This will not go down as a high point for what Americans like to call the world's greatest democracy.
Nah. But we'll always have the Four Seasons Total Landscaping press conference, though.
Yes, to look back on fondly. Of course, a lot of post-election analysis going on, but what we want to do here is to look at the 2020 election through a particular frame, the frame of our latest season, The Land That Never Has Been Yet, in which we told the story of what passes for democracy in the United States. So folks, go listen to season 4 if you haven't. This conversation will have deeper meaning if you do, though hopefully will make some sense regardless.
Yeah, and I mean, what we showed in season 4, step by step, is that, you know, these problems with democracy just didn't start yesterday, right? We showed that anti-democratic forces have actually been active and very powerful throughout the history of this country. And as a result, you know, democracy in America has been fragile, to say the least, and in some ways actually farcical.
Really starting with the colonial settler founding fathers themselves through the 19th and the 20th centuries right up to the present. And you know, Chenj, I'm imagining someone out there who may have listened to our series earlier in 2020 and came away unconvinced.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's people who are like, yeah, I mean, despite the evidence that you've brought, I just don't like this hateful, critical take on America. You're wrong, John. A commitment to democracy courses through the veins of this great nation. It's what makes this nation great, not to mention exceptional. You know, I want to believe that like anybody who thought that before the 2020 election is like been freed from that kind of delusion, but I know that that's probably still not true.
So for us, the question is, what does the 2020 election tell us or remind us about American democracy? The last 4 years have placed, I think, a powerful mirror in front of U.S. society for anyone willing to look in that mirror. But what about this election itself? When we look at the way it has played out, should we be proud and reassured about the strength of democracy in America? or horrified.
And what really are the essential lessons that we have to take from this election and from the Trump years that can guide us going forward and help us to push for a radically more just and democratic society in 2021 and beyond?
Broken shards, all that we are at some time.
I'm John Biewen, host and producer of Scene on Radio.
I'm Chenjerai Kumanyika, assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, organizer, artist, podcaster, co-host, and collaborator with John for season 4.
So to that question about whether we should be reassured or just freshly alarmed, some people are saying, look, the election came off in a pandemic. The people spoke, the levers and the checks and balances functioned as they're supposed to, more or less, and then one court after another rejected Trump's evidence-free claims of election fraud. So all this just shows the strength of America's democratic systems.
Right. I mean, I get that. You'll be shocked to learn I don't see it that way. I mean, yeah, we avoided some of the worst disasters that people were worried about around the election process. That's true.
People were worried that there would be mass voter intimidation and violence at polling places. You know, would the mail system completely fail? Would the Russians or someone else hack into voting systems and create total chaos so that we had no idea of knowing who won? These were things that people worried about.
Right. And I mean, to be fair, those things didn't happen. And that's definitely good. But I think a really important takeaway from this election and from season 4 of Scene on Radio is that the biggest threats to democracy in America have always been internal. You know, we talk about enemies foreign and domestic, but it's been the domestic oppressors that have done the most harm to people in this country.
All throughout the Trump years, and certainly around the election, there's been a lot of talk about norms and restoring what's normal. But really, you know, what are norms in these conversations?
For real, man. I mean, it's like I would argue the discussion of norms has always been an elite kind of discourse, right? Norms are the rules that people who run things agree to keep everything orderly and civil on the surface. And of course, a lot of those rules make sense. But that way of talking about norms really helps to obscure the fact that the normal state of affairs in America is oppressive to a massive number of people. So as long as we have certain structures in place, like peaceful transitions of power and things like that, we can ignore the kind of racial, patriarchal class hierarchy that actually oppresses most people and serves empire, right? Because for me, like, those are actually the most consistent and important norms. And by the way, you know, I've been really also thinking about this idea of a peaceful transition of power, right? We've been talking about that. And it's like, I get why we use that phrase, right? This has to do with how we evaluate a constitutional democracy, right? Mm-hmm. But thinking about all the forms of systemic violence that have persisted, you know, despite the changing administrations in American history, I just feel like the peaceful transition of power doesn't quite capture that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So you think that is there a more accurate phrase for that thing that we're talking about?
As it turns out, I have been working on an alternative phrase. Okay. I'll try it out here. This is an exclusive.
Wow.
So here it is. Instead of saying peaceful transition of power, maybe we could say the more or less consensual transition from one system of organized violence to another.
It has a certain kind of ring to it. So I think it's pretty likely that this Inauguration Day we'll be hearing that on the cable networks.
Right. Yeah. Feel free.
Yes.
They can feel free to use that. I know that sounds like really depressing for me to talk about moving from one system of organized violence to another. Like I'm just killing all the hope we had. But it's not that. It's actually that as we go forward, I think we have to pay attention to think about how there's going to be a certain kinds of continuities that we want to resist, right? And we're not paying attention to those. We're not being serious.
Right. So from that perspective, this point that you've made about, you know, these kind of relatively superficial norms on the one hand, and these much deeper oppressive norms that have characterized U.S. history and society. From that perspective, it's interesting to think about what it means to say that Donald Trump has violated norms. Right? He ran as really a populist demagogue who would do things like talking disrespectfully about a war hero in his own party. He would go ahead and say the racist and sexist parts out loud. And he'd do other things that presidents just aren't supposed to do, in quotes, like fire government officials who are investigating him, right up to using the powers of his office to try to overturn the results of his own election.
Right. And so, what we're really talking about is not really deep, sacred historical norms, but actually just procedures, which in some cases were established fairly recently, right? And yes, Trump has run through those, right? But I would argue that when you look at the values that have guided what he's changed, those values are very consistent with American tradition, right? In a sense, he's trying to hold on to power for himself and keep America in alignment with its real norms, which are racist, sexist, imperialist hierarchies.
Yeah. And the Trump era, I think, has made all of this easier to see, right? So what's different about Trump and now most of his party that have joined him in all this is how openly they've attacked democracy and people's voting rights and so on. Not the mere fact that they have supported anti-democratic structures. That is not new.
Right. I don't think anyone would accuse me of being really romantic about American democracy before the Trump administration, but this whole administration and these elections have actually really taught me something interesting, right? The dominant conversation when we talk about voting rights and we talk about, voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement, we often treat it like an aberration, right? It's an aberration that has historical precedent, but still a deviation from the norm. Whereas what I feel like I've learned during this period is that forms of voter suppression are basically core features of American government. Voter suppression has been a constant throughout U.S. history. As we talked about in season 4, it wasn't until 1965 that you even had the pretense of a fully multiracial democracy in which all adults could vote. But even after women's suffrage and the Indian Citizenship Act and the Voting Rights Act, the counter-majoritarian structures that were baked in from the founding of the country stayed in force. We're still talking about the Electoral College, right?
Yeah.
Which gave us Trump, right? We're still talking about the anti-democratic Senate. We're still having to deal with gerrymandering and taking away the voting rights of most people convicted of felonies. And so all of those things are kind of consistent with that core feature.
So sure, it's an outrage that Trump and much of the Republican Party launched a systematic effort to disenfranchise voters in 2020, especially black voters. They fought against mail-in voting, drive-through voting, the use of drop boxes, all of which were efforts to make it easier for people to vote during a pandemic. They tried to damage the function of the U.S. mail itself. They filed a flurry of lawsuits to shrink the period in which votes could be cast and counted. And then after the election, they tried to use the courts to get legally cast votes thrown out, millions of them if they'd had their way, concentrating mostly on the nation's blackest cities in the states that decided the election. So that's all unusually shameless and out in the open by recent standards. But the point you're making,
it's very much in keeping with the deeper patterns of American democracy.
Yes, so make America great again, in a way, right? So, Chenjerai, American voters did accomplish one crucial thing in the 2020 election. We voted out Donald Trump.
Yes, and I want to be absolutely clear. This was far and away the top priority if we were going to try to preserve any kind of semblance of democratic institutions that we could build on or re-envision.
Yeah.
But, the thing about it is democracy is not just about institutions, right? Any society is also only as democratic as its people are.
In other words, to the extent that we, as citizens, have power that we can wield with our votes and in other ways, we can use that power to preserve and enhance democracy, or we can use that power to undermine democracy because we actually care more about other things.
Right. And so from that vantage point, the disturbing news for democracy in America is that 74 million Americans, 47% of people who voted, said yes to 4 more years of Donald Trump. 10 million more votes than he got last time, after we all had 4 years to watch this man. A climate-destroying, openly racist, misogynistic, deep in debt, incompetent, so corrupt he got impeached, veteran-shaming, super-spreading, failed president. I left out some stuff.
Yeah. The hugging of dictators, the tearing of children from their parents' arms, the profiting from his office, the daily stream of lies and demagoguery. But yeah, for our purposes, let's concentrate on Trump the authoritarian. This is a president who made it clear that he wanted complete control of all levers of power in the U.S. government. The intelligence agencies, the Justice Department, the courts, including the Supreme Court. And that if he could, he would use that power to serve his personal interests, to punish his opponents and lock them up, to help him win re-election, including by applying pressure on foreign leaders, and to hold on to power as long as he wanted it.
And so in a country that supposedly cherishes democracy, 47% of voters said, yes, 4 more years of that dude. And there's something else I have to say, John. You know, there were so many people before this election who just were like hitting me up like, oh my God, what are black people going to do? What are black people going to do? Like, you know, black folks were the real liability here, right? So I just want to be clear. There was only one racial or ethnic group in which Trump won a majority, and that was white people.
Right. White men especially. Though it seems that roughly half of white women, too, voted for Trump. The voter surveys are still kind of shaking out as we record this. So what is up with this? What's going on? People who've listened to the last 3 seasons of this show will have a pretty good idea about some of the values that have very often overwhelmed democracy in the U.S.
Values like white supremacy, white folks fearing the loss of their dominant position and voting for the guy who voices their resentment and reassures them that their way of looking at the world is the right way. And not just poor white people, that multi-class coalition of white people that we heard about in Seeing White, which is held together in this country since the 1600s, folks voting their whiteness. Also patriarchy. You know, because Trump might be a weak man's idea of a strong man, but he wears his sexism and dismissiveness toward women on his sleeve. And 74 million people said yes to that.
I was struck by a quote in the New York Times right after Election Day, in which the leader of a conservative Christian group, Concerned Women for America, said, quote, "We didn't vote for him to be our pastor or our husband. We voted for him to be our bodyguard." I thought, ooh, that's deep. So it smacks of patriarchy. This is the strong man who's going to protect us. But also it gets you thinking about who is this bodyguard going to protect us from, right?
Yeah, and as we've seen time and time again in American history, the threat to security is always presented as the other, right? Black and brown folks, those with anti-American, anti-Christian ideas, like heaven forbid, greater equality and economic security for all.
Yes, which brings us to another factor that seems to have been at play in this election, and we saw it. And, all of this is, there's a lot of fear wrapped up in all of this. And there was a lot of right-wing fear-mongering around socialism, which supposedly was going to be ushered in by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, of all people.
Right. Socialism by 2 of the most centrist, corporate-friendly candidates that ran for the Democratic nomination in 2020. But it's a very old strategy that goes all the way back to the New Deal and actually well before that. Anytime the government might possibly do things for people, that has to be called socialism, which, of course, it's not. But also, I think it's worth talking about what we talk about when we talk about socialism, because because the whole idea of the Enlightenment, right, is that we sort of can be free thinkers and we can sort of evaluate ideas critically, right? But most people I know who fear socialism actually don't know very much about where this idea comes from, right? And so the trick that powerful folks play is to get you to think about dictators in a foreign country or breadlines or something like that, instead of talking about having health care or protections at work or a decent pay or less militarism. And by playing that trick, they get you to automatically reject any other option as un-American, un-Christian, and just unthinkable. And oh, by the way, socialism is also presented as undemocratic. Even when the policies being discussed are what people want, it's somehow the opposite of freedom.
So in order to fend off this shadowy idea of socialism that would allegedly take away our democratic freedoms, folks instead voted for a would-be autocrat with no regard for democracy, our own wannabe Mussolini. We just really need to sit with this fact. I think that 47% of Americans who voted and the majority of white voters made that choice. To your point about a country only being as democratic as its people are.
And it's also another reminder that people yell about external threat of socialism when the real dangers are already here at home. But there's also another really important reason that some people say they voted for Trump. People said they voted their faith, right? Exit polls found 75 to 80% of white evangelical voters went for Trump. And a lot of those folks say abortion and appointing anti-abortion judges is a top issue for them. And this is what gets called a pro-life vote.
Yeah, I have a feeling I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a concern about the lives of the unborn, but not so much for a lot of us after we're born, right? Including young children separated from their parents, or the millions of poor people in this country, or the 250,000 people who've died so far, most of them unnecessarily from COVID, or the people who get sent off to war.
So, yeah, maybe it's not really all about life, though a lot of these same folks do like to say that all lives matter. But staying on the subject of the American people and whether we're actually any good at democracy as a people, in Season 4 we devoted a couple of episodes to us, the people, and how prepared we are to be good citizens, particularly in terms of the information we get. So we looked at our education system and news media and the role that they play in American democracy.
Yeah, and so just looking at how this election played out, I mean, I think the results really reinforce the point that so many of us, too many of us, are just not well informed. I mean, folks' understanding of how the world works, right? Like who actually holds power? Who should they be mad at for the things they're frustrated about, right? I mean, besides the confusions we already talked about around socialism and other things, we had all these wild conspiracy theories that millions of people bought into. QAnon, right? Theories about COVID-19, that it was sent by communist China to destroy America, or that it was just a hoax, despite the 250,000 Americans who've died from it.
Yes, and now millions of Americans are buying into Trump's lies about the election, that Democrats somehow rigged the whole thing to steal the election from Trump, but they did it in such a subtle, kind of genius way that they chose to let Republicans do better than expected in the Senate, the House, and state legislatures.
I mean, so looking at that, right, it's just like at the most basic level, it does seem hard to imagine a way forward in this country when we can't even agree on basic facts. And when we don't have sources of information that Americans sort of agree that we can trust. I mean, it's sort of hard to know how to put that toothpaste back in the tube. But I think we also have to be careful about some of these narratives of like that we've sort of fallen from a much more educated era, right? It's like, it's not really clear to me that there's ever been a strong factual consensus driving this country. So, you know, there's a tendency to talk about some of these things as just like matters of education, or that these people have just been subject to disinformation, right? Like if we could just get these people off Facebook and reading the New York Times, all of this would be better, right? I mean, it's like, and I think it's true that less educated people are more vulnerable to certain kinds of disinformation. But, you know, when you look at a lot of the historical revelations about how power really works in America that we've explored in this series, I mean, this is stuff that highly educated people consistently tell us they never learned.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I think that means is that there are certain kinds of myths that get institutionalized in this country, and then they don't get called disinformation.
Right. So there's a deeper kind of education that has to happen about really the story of this country beyond just, getting our facts straight about issues in the news this week.
That's right.
We devoted our last episode of season 4 to steps we need to take as a country to get more democratic. Things like, get rid of the Electoral College, transform the Senate, make it easy to vote, reform the courts, deal with gerrymandering. All things that would strengthen the power of the majority of the people, in contrast to what we have now, where a plutocratic minority has way more than its share of power, and always has. But let's wrap up this episode by going back to the big picture, the future of democracy in the U.S. And I think, I don't know if you even want to talk about silver linings with the Trump years, but I think one thing that's happened, it seems to me, is that more and more people out there understand that we've been living under minority rule for a long time, and that, if anything, that fact is intensifying.
Right. And on top of all that, I think more people can see that the Trump era has unleashed some truly scary anti-democratic tendencies that have always been present in this country. I'm talking about like an attraction to outright fascism and authoritarianism, mostly among white people. And that attraction is wrapped up with those long-standing hierarchies, right? White supremacy, patriarchy, nationalism, and imperialism. So, fortunately, we got Trump the man out, but I think there's a lot of ways in which Trump's values and his legacy are still with us.
Yeah.
That could feel like a really depressing take. I get it. But I just want people to be crystal clear. Like, I'm actually hopeful. But my hope doesn't come from the fact that I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to move us into a glorious new era of anti-racist social justice or something like that.
Yeah. Now, they did wind up running on a platform that in many ways is more progressive than previous Democratic candidates. But their long-standing instincts, both of them, they're quite centrist, as we've said, and some of their early moves in the transition even have raised alarm bells for progressives. For example, naming a guy with ties to the chemical industry to help lead Biden's transition team on the environment.
Yeah, so any hopefulness that I feel is not actually about them, right? I mean, history has shown that positive change doesn't come about because of the values and instincts of the president or vice president. It comes from the people and movements creating the conditions that force leaders to embrace radical change. I was just listening to Adolph Reed, and he gave a really interesting example of this. In many ways, Richard Nixon, of all people, was forced to embrace policies that were more progressive than anything that got achieved by later Democratic presidents like Clinton and Obama. I mean, I'm talking about things like the National Environmental Policy Act, right? He signed the Social Security Amendments of 1972, which extended Medicare to people under 65 who are disabled. And also the Nixon Family Assistance Plan, right? Which would have paid a minimum income to poor families. I mean, that plan never made it out of committee in the Senate. But I mean, the fact that he sort of initiated that, right? I don't bring up these policies to celebrate Nixon at all. It's sort of the opposite, right?
Yeah.
I don't think those policies are because Nixon had those inclinations, right? But he was forced to do that because movements on the ground were strong at the time.
And that echoes themes that we hit on throughout season 4, right? If you looked at Lincoln eventually adopting emancipation, if you look at a lot of the pressure that was applied to FDR, right? It was movements, not individual leaders, that brought about our deepest kinds of change. History is going to look back at the Trump years as a crisis for sure, and maybe a turning point. But I think it remains to be seen, what kind of turning point. Will the last 4 years be seen as a huge step on the road to the real death of democracy in America, or as a crisis that sparked a new reconstruction, as some have called it, a third reconstruction, after the first one in the 1860s and 70s, and the second in the 1960s, that both of which pushed the country forward as a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, man. I think as we move forward into this next period, it's really important to be clear about where the source of our hope and where our energy should be. The reason why I voted for Biden and Harris, I'm speaking for myself, is because I wanted to choose the person I was going to fight.
Yeah.
You know, building something closer to a true democracy and to a society that's radically more just and fair for everyone, that's going to take commitment and actual work by millions of us. We should be looking for where we can join with people who are doing the organizing, right, doing the work, and really putting our shoulders to the wheel. We have the power to make a different kind of world. We just have to keep getting together and keep using that power.
Thank you, Dr. Chenjerai Kumanyika. And thanks for listening, everybody. Do go back to our Season 4 if you haven't listened yet. We think it explains a lot about the state U.S. democracy is in and how we got here. How about Season 5? I know some of you will ask. It's a ways off, probably well into 2021. Thank you for your patience. Looking forward to having more new stuff for you all to listen to. Our editor is Loretta Williams. Our theme song for Season 4 is The Underside of Power by Algiers. Other music on this episode by Eric Neveu and Lucas Biewen. Music consulting and production help by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. The website is scenonradio.org. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at scenonradio. Chenjerai on Twitter is at catchatweetdown. Scene on Radio comes to you from the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University.
From PRX.